Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. You know, yesterday the State Department issued a statement mourning the death of the Iranian president. Now, I assume as Secretary you share that sentiment?
We expressed official condolences, as we've done when countries, adversaries, enemies or not, have lost leaders. It changes nothing about the fact that Mr. Raisi was engaged in reprehensible conduct, including repressing his own people for many years as a judge, and that as president. It changes not a whit about our policy, but it's something that we've done many times in the past, going back many administrations and many decades, and we do as a normal course of business.
Well, I don't think it should be a normal course of business. I think it's shocking that this administration would mourn the death of the butcher of Tehran. I don't. He's responsible for death, rape, torture, a sworn enemy of the free world. So I think it's a terrible mistake, Mr. Secretary. I want to move on to another issue in terms of some of the evacuations and retreats that are happening around the world. Since the deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, the administration has urgently evacuated Americans at several embassies across the globe. I hadn't expected to hear about this in Wyoming, but I heard about it again in Wyoming just this past weekend. Whether it's in Burma, Belarus, Sudan, Haiti, there seems to be a dangerous growing trend of the U.S. in retreat. The United States has been forced to draw down, evacuate, and close numerous diplomatic posts. It used to be rare to see images of U.S. troops flying to the rescue to evacuate our embassies, but it's becoming a more common sight under this administration. 2023, U.S. troops and 3 helicopters airlifted 70 American employees from Sudan. 2024, in Haiti, U.S. military airlifted over 30 stranded Americans. It appears the administration has become the administration of evacuations. During your leadership as Secretary of State, how many embassies have we had to close or evacuate?
Senator, we are operating and living in a very dangerous world. We have Americans all over the world. We have embassies all over the world. It's important that wherever we can, we be represented and our diplomacy is able to move forward, as has been the case many times in the past, whether it was in Venezuela in 2019, whether it was in Yemen in 2015, in Libya in 2014, in Syria in 2012, in Libya again in 2011, in Lebanon in 2006. I could go down the list. Sometimes you run into crises where either an embassy has to shut down for some period of time, or you have Americans who are in harm's way. And in the past, we have, as a country, not often engaged in the evacuation of Americans, but we see it as our responsibility when Americans are in harm's way to try to do that. In the instances that you've cited, that's exactly what we did. You have a crisis, you have some kind of situation that runs the risk of putting at harm either our own embassy employees or Americans who may be there. We're going to make sure that job number one is protecting our people.
Do you see a unifying underlying factor for this terrible trend, and then how are you addressing that?
I don't. I think each of these situations is distinct. And what I do see is a country that over the last 3 years has renewed its alliances, has revitalized its alliances, has created new ones, so that whether it's with our core allies in Europe, in Asia, or beyond, we don't have to face these situations alone. And I see American leadership that has brought these alliances and partnerships together in ways that were not the case in recent history. And that is a great source of strength for us as we have to deal with a very challenging world.
So the administration is following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, left behind weapons, ammunition, and equipment that ultimately armed the Taliban. Now we've announced a withdrawal from Niger. State Department efforts to reestablish relations and engage in diplomacy there have failed. The government there is demanding that we leave. Our nation is withdrawing 1,000 troops from 2 air bases where we conducted important counterterrorism missions for decades. Media reports already indicate that Russian troops have already been deployed to these air bases where American soldiers are located. Do you know how much American taxpayer money has the United States spent on building these bases and training the military there?
We've seen, as you know, Senator, in the case of Niger, a coup that took place. We sought to find a mutually acceptable way to keep our forces there so that they could pursue the counterterrorism mission that they were engaged in. We couldn't reach such an agreement with the current government in Niger, and so we are pursuant to conversations with them, pulling back of horses. If they're not wanted there, then they won't be there. We will make, as we have, other arrangements in other places to make sure that we can conduct the necessary missions to ensure our security.
Do you not see risk, though, of the American taxpayer-funded bases ultimately ending up in the hands of the Russians? And now we're seeing the Russia's, Wagner mercenary group providing military training and support, Burkina Faso, Mali, and in addition to where you mentioned. How are we countering Russia's newly created foothold in Africa?
Well, there's two things. One, of course, is the military element to this, and of course I defer to the Pentagon on the specifics of that, including what they pull out as any forces leave. But second, I think we know that unless you have a comprehensive approach that works to try to shore up these countries economically, democratically, socially, the military piece is necessary, but it's insufficient. And we have, thanks to the work of Congress, in countries adjacent to the Sahel, the Global Fragility Act, which gives us 10-year plans to help countries get on their feet in a sustainable way. And that creates partnerships that allow us to sustain, as necessary, a military presence. But you have very fragile countries in the Sahel, and yes, there have been a series of non-democratic transitions or coups in these countries, and that's simply a fact of life. Now, I believe that we can bring much more to the table than the Russians can, for example. And when countries experience what the Russians bring to the table in terms of the exploitation of their resources, the brutalization of their people, actually more violence and more extremism, more terrorism, they tend to change their minds and have a different perspective on this. It's unfortunate that some countries have to find out the hard way that is not the recipe to their security or their success.
Well, thank you. I would add that once they find out the hard way, it may be very difficult for them to extract themselves from the domination of the Russians and come back to us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.